It is noteworthy that the mistreatment suffered by black male slaves from elite white women during the antebellum era is a relatively lesser-known aspect of slavery's history. While most scholarly studies and historical accounts focus on the experiences of enslaved individuals under white male slave owners, there were instances where elite white women participated in or were complicit in the abuse of black male slaves. The mistreatment took various forms, including physical punishment, sexual exploitation, and psychological degradation. Elite white women held power and authority within the plantation system and often had control over enslaved individuals as part of their household staff. They could issue commands, enforce discipline, and exert control over the lives of these enslaved individuals, including black male slaves. Physical punishment ranged from verbal and emotional abuse to physical violence, such as whipping or beating. Black male slaves were subject to mistreatment and punishment by their white female owners, who could administer it directly or delegate the task to overseers or other male slaves. Sexual exploitation and abuse also occurred, although the extent and prevalence are challenging to determine due to the lack of first-hand accounts from enslaved individuals. Some elite white women engaged in sexual relationships with black male slaves, which varied from coerced encounters to potentially more consensual relationships. However, these relationships were often marked by a significant power imbalance and influenced by the system of slavery, making it difficult to ascertain the true nature of consent in those situations. Psychological degradation and humiliation were also common forms of abuse. Elite white women would demean and dehumanize black male slaves, perpetuating racist stereotypes and treating them as objects or property rather than recognizing their humanity. It is crucial to acknowledge that while these instances occurred, they do not represent all relationships between white women and enslaved individuals. The experiences of black male slaves varied depending on the specific dynamics of the plantation and household in which they were enslaved. Additionally, the experiences of black women and enslaved individuals in general should not be overlooked or marginalized when discussing slavery and abuse. Due to limited historical documentation and the complex power dynamics involved, further research and scholarly exploration are necessary to fully comprehend the extent and impact of the abuse endured by black male slaves at the hands of elite white women during the antebellum era. The term antebellum comes from the Latin words ante meaning before and bellum meaning war. In American history, the antebellum era refers to the period preceding the American Civil War, specifically from the late 18th century, after the War of 1812, until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. The term antebellum era is commonly used to describe this time because it encompasses the distinctive social, economic, and political characteristics that ultimately led to the conflict and division resulting in the Civil War. It was a period of significant growth and transformation in the United States, characterized by industrialization, westward expansion, and debates surrounding slavery. During this era, Southern intellectuals and leaders gradually shifted their portrayal of slavery from an embarrassing and temporary system to a defense of slavery as a positive institution. The emerging abolitionist movement faced harsh criticism from these leaders for its opposition to slavery. The demand for slave labor, coupled with the U.S. ban on importing more slaves from Africa, drove up slave prices, making it profitable for smaller farms in established areas like Virginia to sell their slaves further south and west. While most farmers in the South had small to medium-sized farms with few slaves, the wealth of large plantation owners, often measured by the number of slaves they owned, granted them considerable prestige and political power. Throughout the antebellum era, the nation grappled with contentious issues such as states' rights, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and tensions between the northern and southern states. These factors contributed to the eventual outbreak of the Civil War, which had a profound and lasting impact on the country. While the dehumanization and mistreatment of slaves during this period are well documented, including instances of sexual abuse and complex relationships between white slave masters and black women, a lesser-known aspect is the abuse endured by black male slaves at the hands of elite white women, specifically those belonging to the planter class. The planter class refers to a specific group of elite women who were part of the wealthy plantation-owning class in the antebellum South. These women were associated with wealthy plantation owners who primarily focused on cultivating cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and rice, relying heavily on slave labor. The wealthy plantation owners of the antebellum South were known as the planter class, while their wives held privileged positions within the social hierarchy and were referred to as planter class white women. This video takes an intersectional socio-historical approach to explore the often overlooked history of exploitation and mistreatment faced by black male slaves. It delves into the factors that may have contributed to the occurrence of sexual encounters between planter-class white women and enslaved individuals, examining the power dynamics embedded in these relationships and their implications in terms of sexual consent. The segment also highlights how these upper-class white women used sex as a means of wielding power, perpetuating both white supremacy and patriarchy during this dark era. Slavery was not only a system based on racial subjugation, but it also reinforced gender hierarchies. While planter-class white women in the antebellum South were constrained by societal expectations of femininity, they still held considerable power within the institution of slavery. These women actively participated in maintaining and perpetuating the system. They had authority over the management and treatment of enslaved individuals, including black male slaves. White women possessed the power to issue commands, give instructions, and enforce discipline within their households and on plantations. It is important to note that in the American South before the Civil War, white women were unable to vote, hold office, and their property technically belonged to their husbands upon marriage. However, they had one notable capability that aligned with white men: they could own, buy, and sell slaves. The economic power gained by white women through the ownership of enslaved individuals was significant. Enslaved people were considered valuable property, serving as a source of wealth and prosperity. Their labor, particularly in agricultural work on plantations, generated profits for white women slave owners. Ownership of enslaved individuals often came through inheritance from parents, husbands, or other family members. Upon the death of a relative, white women would inherit enslaved people, further increasing their wealth and property holdings. In some cases, they inherited substantial numbers of enslaved individuals, consolidating their economic and social status. White women played a central role in managing enslaved individuals within their households. They oversaw domestic operations, supervising enslaved domestic workers such as cooks, maids, and nurses. These individuals were responsible for maintaining the household and providing services that contributed to the comfort and lifestyle of white women and their families. Some white women actively participated in the buying and selling of enslaved individuals, engaging in slave auctions for personal use or investment purposes. Their direct involvement in the slave trade allowed them to profit from the sale and ownership of enslaved people. Legal protections and rights were afforded to white women as slave owners. They had the ability to seek legal remedies if their property rights were violated or if they faced issues related to the management or treatment of their enslaved individuals. These legal rights further solidified their power and control over the lives of enslaved people. It is crucial to acknowledge that the experiences and levels of involvement of white women in slavery varied. Some owned large plantations with extensive enslaved labor forces, while others had smaller-scale operations with fewer individuals. Nevertheless, their ownership of enslaved people contributed to the perpetuation of the oppressive and exploitative institution of slavery. In her book, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, historian Stephanie Jones Rogers challenges previous arguments that white women were passive bystanders in the business of slavery. Drawing on interviews conducted with formerly enslaved individuals during the Great Depression as part of the Federal Writers Project, Jones Rogers demonstrates that white women actively engaged in and benefited from owning enslaved people. These interviews shed light on the training white girls received in slave ownership, discipline, and mastery from a young age, sometimes receiving enslaved individuals as gifts as early as 9 months old. Slaveholding parents taught their daughters how to be slave owners, providing lessons on slave discipline and management. Some even allowed their daughters to administer physical punishments. Jones Rogers reveals that slaveholding parents and family members would gift girls enslaved individuals for Christmas or on special occasions like their 16th or 21st birthdays. There are documented cases of slaveholding parents and family members giving white female infants their own enslaved individuals. In one specific instance recorded in a court record, a woman recounts how her grandfather gave her an enslaved person as her own when she was only 9 months old. It raises the question of how a 9-month-old baby could know that she had a slave if she wasn't informed. It appears that she had been educated about the situation. Growing up, she understood that an absolute authority over another human being had been granted to her, that she possessed a human being as her property. These deeply flawed mental structures have significantly contributed to the creation of highly racist and supremacist personalities and societies. It is crucial to deconstruct and challenge this mentality and strive for a new mindset that views and treats everyone as equals. Sexual exploitation was one of the most distressing aspects of the abuse suffered by black male slaves at the hands of elite white women. Despite the prevailing narrative portraying white women as passive or innocent, there were instances where they actively engaged in non-consensual sexual relationships and rape, taking advantage of their power and control over black male slaves. These actions perpetuated a cycle of sexual violence and degradation, further dehumanizing the already enslaved. In Harriet Jacobs' autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she recounts how planters' daughters would exploit male slaves. These women knew that the female slaves were subjected to their father's authority, and in some cases, they exercised the same authority over the male slaves. Jacobs describes witnessing a master of such a household who felt shame because his daughter had chosen one of the most oppressed slaves on the plantation to be the father of her first grandchild. The relationships described by the author clearly exhibit sexually predatory behavior. Such acts, as confirmed by Jacobs, were not uncommon and cannot be classified as consensual. They constituted sexual abuse, if not rape. Another way in which planter-class white women exerted sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they did not comply with their demands. By doing so, elite white women manipulated one of the primary tools of patriarchal repression, the notion that they were weak and in need of protection from white men. As with many other mean acts in history with justifications, this was no different. White women who abused black male slaves within the system of slavery often employed various justifications to rationalize their actions. Many subscribed to the prevailing ideology of white supremacy, which asserted the superiority of white people over black people. As part of the dominant racial group, they believed they had the right to exert control and dominance over enslaved individuals. This ideology provided a moral framework that justified their abusive behavior. Within the social structure of the time, white women were expected to maintain control and authority within their households. Some justified their abuse of black male slaves as a means of asserting their authority and preserving the social order. They saw themselves as upholding societal norms by disciplining and punishing enslaved individuals who were considered their property. Slavery was deeply intertwined with the economic system that benefited many white families. Some white women justified their abuse of black male slaves as necessary to maintain discipline and productivity on plantations or within their households. They believed that harsh treatment was essential to ensure the labor and obedience of enslaved individuals, which they viewed as crucial for economic prosperity. Religious and moral arguments were also used by some white women to rationalize their abuse of black male slaves. They interpreted religious teachings to support the notion of white superiority and the inherent inferiority of black people. They believed that their actions were justified in the eyes of God and saw themselves as fulfilling their religious and moral duties. It is important to recognize that these justifications were deeply rooted in the systemic racism and dehumanization that characterized the institution of slavery. They served to maintain power imbalances and perpetuate the subjugation of enslaved individuals. Today, these justifications are widely acknowledged as deeply flawed and morally reprehensible. The motives behind why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves likely varied from one situation to another. Some may have been driven by boredom or sexual frustration, while others, perhaps on a subconscious level, used the sexual exploitation of slaves as a way to compensate for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. Planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and had limited sexual agency compared to men. It is possible that the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men provided them with a sense of enjoyment and a feeling of power. By 1830, physical abuse was prevalent. Slavery, which was primarily practiced in the South, took various forms, with African Americans enslaved on small farms, large plantations, in cities, towns, homes, fields, and in various industries and transportation. Although slavery manifested in different ways, the underlying concept remained the same. Slaves were regarded as property solely because of their race. Their status as property was maintained through acts of violence, both real and threatened. Black and white individuals coexisted within these parameters, and their interactions took many different forms. Physical violence was not limited to white male slaveholders. White women also participated in acts of brutality against black male slaves. These acts ranged from whipping and beating to other forms of physical punishment, leaving lasting physical and psychological wounds. An infamous example of extreme physical abuse inflicted on black male and female slaves is the story of Madame Mary Delphine LaLaurie. One particularly well-known incident occurred in 1834 when a fire broke out at LaLaurie's mansion on 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans, Louisiana. As people rushed to extinguish the flames, they discovered a hidden attic where enslaved individuals were reportedly held captive and subjected to extreme abuse. According to witnesses, they found slaves who were emaciated, chained to the walls, and showing signs of severe mistreatment. Reports suggest that Madame LaLaurie carried out various forms of physical torture on her enslaved individuals. Some accounts mention that she used implements such as whips, paddles, and spiked collars to discipline and punish them. It is said that she would brutally beat and mutilate her slaves, inflicting wounds and injuries that were often left untreated. One particularly gruesome account involves an enslaved woman who was discovered with her stomach sliced open and her intestines spilling out, indicating a cruel and sadistic act of violence. Another account suggests that Madame LaLaurie performed crude medical experiments on her slaves, including amputations and other painful procedures, without anesthesia or proper medical care. These alleged acts of physical torture and abuse led to public outrage when they were exposed. A mob gathered at LaLaurie's mansion, and she was forced to flee the city to escape their wrath. Afterward, the mansion was looted and vandalized, and the extent of the horrors that occurred within its walls became widely known. Legend has it that a 70-year-old slave cook, who had been chained to the stove in the kitchen by LaLaurie and was slowly starving to death, started the fire. During interrogation, the cook admitted to starting the fire as an attempt to kill herself rather than face LaLaurie's torture. LaLaurie had threatened to take her to the top room, from which no one ever returned. Following this revelation, the top chamber was broken into to investigate the cook's claims, and it was undoubtedly a hellish place for the unfortunate slaves. Maria Delphine McCarty, later known as Madame Mary Delphine LaLaurie, was born on March 19, 1787, in Spanish-ruled New Orleans. For most of her life, there were no indications of cruelty or evil. Despite rumors that slaves had killed her parents, she lived a relatively normal and privileged life. She was a respected figure in New Orleans high society, known for her kindness, gentleness, and courtesy. LaLaurie's father was Louis Bartholomew de McCarty, and her mother was Marie-Jean Mirabella, also known as the Widow LeComte. Both of her parents were prominent members of the European Creole community in town. LaLaurie married 3 times and had 5 children whom she reportedly cared for lovingly. Her first husband was a Spaniard named Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish officer. They had a daughter together before his untimely death. 4 years later, Lalaurie remarried to a Frenchman named Jean Blanc, a wealthy banker, lawyer, and legislator. They had 4 children together. After Blanc's death, Lalaurie married her third and final husband, a much younger doctor named Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie. In 1831, Madame Lalaurie purchased a 3-story mansion on 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter and, like many affluent women of the time, owned slaves. According to Harriet Martin, who visited New Orleans in 1836 and wrote about her experiences in 1838, she heard stories from residents about the miserable condition of Madame Lalaurie's slaves. However, in public, Lalaurie appeared polite to black people and seemed concerned about their well-being. Court records indicate that she emancipated 2 of her slaves, John Lewis in 1819 and Advance in 1832. Funeral registers from 1830 to 1834 recorded the deaths of 12 slaves at Lalaurie's Royal Street mansion, but the causes of death were not specified. Despite rumors about her mistreatment of slaves, a local lawyer who visited the mansion found no evidence of wrongdoing. However, after the lawyer's visit, a neighbor witnessed a 12-year-old slave girl falling to her death from the mansion's roof while trying to escape punishment from Lalaurie, who was wielding a whip. There are 2 documented cases of individuals who were so terrified of punishment that they resorted to self-harm, including one man who jumped out of a 3rd-story window and another incident involving a 12-year-old slave girl named Leah. In 1833, Leah accidentally pulled Lalaurie's hair too hard, resulting in Lalaurie becoming enraged and chasing the girl with a whip until she fell off the roof and died. An investigation took place, and the Lalauries were found guilty of cruel treatment. Lalaurie was fined $300 and had to forfeit 9 of her slaves, but she repurchased them through a relative and continued to torture them until the night of the fire in 1834. On April 10, 1834, Mary Delphine Lalaurie and her husband fled on a boat, leaving the butler, who had also participated in the torture, to face the anger of the crowd that had stormed into their mansion. Some historians speculate that the death of Lalaurie's family during the Haitian Rebellion may have triggered a dark side in her, but this does not excuse her outrageous actions. Although no charges were filed against Lalaurie, her reputation among the upper-class society was ruined. She is believed to have died in Paris in December 1842. While the exact details of the physical torture inflicted by Madame Lalaurie may be difficult to ascertain with absolute certainty, the accounts and testimonies available paint a disturbing picture of the extreme abuse suffered by the enslaved individuals under her control. Her actions highlight the depths of cruelty that some slave owners were capable of during that era. The prevailing social norms and power dynamics of the time made it challenging for white women to openly speak out against the abuse of black male slaves. There were some instances of white women who did express opposition or worked towards improving the conditions of enslaved individuals. However, it is important to note that such instances were relatively rare and often faced significant resistance and backlash. However, it is crucial to recognize that the majority of white women during that time either actively participated in or silently condoned the system of slavery. The prevailing social and cultural norms limited their ability to openly oppose the institution and its abuses. The intersectionality of race and gender meant that white women, too, were influenced by the power structures that upheld slavery, making it difficult for them to openly challenge the system without facing severe consequences. The story of Madame Mary Delphine Lalaurie and her mansion serves as a chilling reminder of the harsh realities of slavery and the depths of human cruelty. It stands as a testament to the resilience and strength of those who endured her oppressive rule, emphasizing the significance of acknowledging and confronting the darker chapters of our history. Exploring the mistreatment of black male slaves by white women brings to light a disturbing aspect of history that has often been overlooked or deliberately silenced. By acknowledging this painful truth, we challenge the conventional narrative of slavery and deepen our comprehension of the intricate power dynamics at play. Recognizing these historical injustices is a crucial step towards fostering a more inclusive and fair future.
As light-skinned enslaved women who were the product of mixed-race couplings were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation, so were light-skinned male slaves finding themselves a great deal the particular target of such sexual exploitation. Apparently, they may have attracted their enslavers more, who in most cases were swooned by the mere sight of them and would exert racial supremacist authority over exercising them as their sex property. As Thomas Buckley found in his analysis of divorce in antebellum Virginia, roughly 9% of Virginia's divorce petitions from 1786 to 1851 were for interracial adultery, with 23 of those petitions coming from white men who complained about their wives' relationships with black men. Peter Nielsen, traveling in Virginia in the 1820s, recorded that he had learned about a planter's daughter having fallen in love with one of her father's slaves. She had actually seduced him. In her 1861 autobiography, Harriet Jacobs told the chilling story of a male slave named Luke, who was kept chained at his bedridden master's bedside so that he would be constantly available to tend to his physical needs, which included sexual favors. In veiled language so as not to offend the sensibilities of 19th century polite society, Jacobs reported that most days Luke was only allowed to wear a shirt so that he could be easily flogged if he committed an infraction such as resisting his master's sexual advances. In a 2011 Journal of the History of Sexuality article, the scholar Thomas Foster contended that enslaved black men regularly were sexually exploited by both white men and white women, which took a variety of forms, including outright physical penetrative assault, forced reproduction, sexual coercion and manipulation, and psychic abuse. In one example provided by Foster, a man named Lewis Bourne filed for divorce in 1824 due to his wife's longtime sexual liaison and continued pursuit of a male slave named Edmund from their community. Foster contended that such pursuits could enable white women to enact radical fantasies of domination over white men, while at the same time subjecting the black enslaved male to her control. Foster also contended that such pursuits were not uncommon, as demonstrated by testimonies from the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, established by the Secretary of War in 1863, which took depositions from abolitionists and slaves regarding the realities of slave life. Such depositions included stories of sexual liaisons between enslaved men and their mistresses. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women forcing black men into having sex. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, stated, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. Foster further concurs with scholars who argue that rape can serve as a metaphor for both enslaved women and men, as the vulnerability of all enslaved black persons to nearly every conceivable violation produced a collective rape subjectivity. Most Americans know that George Washington owned enslaved people at his Mount Vernon home, but fewer probably know that it was his wife, Martha, who dramatically increased the enslaved population there. When they wed in 1759, George may have owned around 18 people. Martha, one of the richest women in Virginia, owned 84. The high number of people Martha Washington owned is unusual, but the fact that she owned them is not. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley, is compiling data on just how many white women owned slaves in the U.S., and in the parts of the 1850 and 1860 census data she has studied so far, white women make up about 40% of all slave owners. Slaveholding parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, says Jones Rogers, whose book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, came out in February 2019. What this means is that their very identities as white Southern women are tied to the actual or the possible ownership of other people. White women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved people, in whom they had a vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved people made a woman a better marriage prospect. Yes, you heard correctly. Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved people as opposed to their husband's ownership, and often won. For them, slavery was their freedom, Jones Rogers observes in her book. Previous scholars have argued that most Southern white women did not buy, sell, or inflict violence on enslaved people because this was considered improper for them. But Jones Rogers discovers that white women were actually trained to participate from a very young age. Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they are little girls, sometimes infants, when they are given enslaved people as gifts, she says. Citing interviews with formerly enslaved people that the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal agency, conducted in the 1930s, Jones Rogers shows that part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people. It did not matter whether the child was large or small, one woman told the WPA. They always beat you till the blood ran down. As adults, white women often tore black women away from their babies so they could nurse the white mistress's baby instead. To this end, white women placed thousands of advertisements in newspapers looking for enslaved wet nurses to feed their own children and created a huge market for enslaved black women who had recently given birth. Why did these white women want black women to nurse their children? One complained she felt like continuously having children and continuously nursing her children made her a slave to her children. That's an actual quote, Jones Rogers says. Some white mothers, such as Jane Pettigrew, cited convenience. She had a distaste for breastfeeding her own infants because it made her a slave to her children. Some black women reported in WPA, Works Progress Administration, interviews that their mothers would always give birth around the same time as the white mistress, suggesting that these mistresses were also orchestrating the sexual assault of enslaved women. Rogers continues, there were instances in which formerly enslaved people did in fact say that their mistresses either sanctioned acts of sexual violence against them that were perpetrated at the hands of white men, or that they orchestrated instances of sexual violence between two enslaved people that they owned, in hopes of producing children from those acts of sexual violence. White women also fought to maintain the wealth and free labor that slavery provided them through the Civil War. The Civil War was America's bloodiest and most divisive conflict, pitting the Union Army against the Confederate States of America. The war resulted in the deaths of more than 620,000 people, with millions more injured and the South left in ruins. As Union troops made their way through the South freeing enslaved people, white women would move enslaved people farther from the soldiers' path. One woman, Martha Gibbs, even took enslaved people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. After the Civil War, Southern white women sought to recreate slavery through exploitative work contracts. Some even wrote books portraying the institution of slavery as gentle and benign, the most famous being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, a woman born 35 years after abolition. Yet, as Jones Rogers argues in her book, it was not only white women's ideological and sentimental connections to slavery that made them defend it. Scarlett O'Hara would have been protecting her economic interests too, she says. Scarlett O'Hara is a fictional character and the protagonist of the novel Gone with the Wind, written by Margaret Mitchell. The novel was published in 1936 and was set during the American Civil War and Reconstruction era. While sexual labor was very much a part of British and American slavery, instances of sexual abuse in women's slave narratives were encoded in the language within women's slave narratives. When Harriet Jacobs wrote, "O virtuous reader, you never knew what it means to be a slave," in her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, calling to her audience even as she challenged their position of privilege, to describe the prevalence of sexual abuse within the institution of slavery. Jacobs not only broke convention, pushing the boundaries of the slave narrative genre, but also shattered the silences surrounding instances of sexual abuse and slavery. Silence, Narratives, and Resistance sheds light on how the stories of black male slaves who suffered abuse at the hands of white women were systematically suppressed and hidden from mainstream historical accounts. This suppression was driven by the desire to maintain a carefully constructed image of white femininity and the broader narrative of slavery that focused predominantly on white male slaveholders and their actions. For this reason, the voices of enslaved individuals, especially black male slaves, were often disregarded or dismissed in historical documentation. Slave narratives and accounts that depicted white women as perpetrators of abuse were seen as a threat to the prevailing social order. Publishing such narratives could challenge the prevailing perception of white womanhood and undermine the image of the virtuous and refined Southern lady. Enslaved individuals face severe consequences for speaking out or revealing the harsh realities of their lives under slavery. To protect themselves and their loved ones, many slaves hesitated to openly disclose the abuse they endured, especially if it involved white women. However, despite the efforts to silence these narratives, some instances of resistance and resilience have been preserved in historical records and slave narratives. The abuse of black male slaves by white women represents a distressing and overlooked aspect of slavery's dark history. By exploring the power dynamics, sexual exploitation, and physical and psychological abuse endured by black male slaves, we shed light on the complex interactions between race, gender, and power during this era. Acknowledging and understanding this painful history is an essential step towards a more inclusive and just society, where the voices and experiences of all victims of historical oppression are recognized and remembered.
In the complex web of American history, the narratives surrounding slavery often omit the multifaceted realities of abuse and exploitation experienced by black men at the hands of white women. While the overarching story tends to focus on the physical and emotional torment inflicted by white men, it is crucial to acknowledge and discuss the equally insidious roles that white women played within this system of oppression. Their actions, often overlooked in the larger discourse, reveal a painful truth about the depth of exploitation and abuse within the institution of slavery. For centuries, the backbone of the American economy was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Black men were treated as property, stripped of their humanity, and subjected to relentless brutality, both physical and psychological. While many narratives emphasize the violence wrought by white male slave owners, there exists a darker, more nuanced layer of cruelty that involves white women who were complicit in or actively participated in the dehumanization of black men. It is important to recognize that white women in the antebellum South were not mere passive actors within the institution of slavery. Many occupied privileged positions within their households that allowed them to wield significant power over the lives of the enslaved people who worked for them. They often played a dual role, as protectors of white femininity and as enforcers of a system that sought to maintain the status quo of racial subjugation. The emotional and physical abuse suffered by black men at their hands is a narrative that must be unearthed and examined with the seriousness it deserves. One of the most harrowing aspects of this abuse was the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by white women. While the sexual abuse of black women is widely documented and acknowledged, the experiences of black men are frequently sidelined. However, many enslaved men were also subjected to unwanted advances and objectification by white women. This abuse not only reinforced their status as mere property, but also perpetuated a narrative of racially charged sexuality, wherein black male bodies were both desired and dehumanized. The societal dynamics at play allowed white women to perpetrate such abuses without consequence. The patriarchal structure of slavery granted them a measure of authority that was often unchallenged. Enslaved men, in the precarious position of property, were left vulnerable to the whims of their captors, including white women. The violence inflicted upon them was not solely physical, but also psychological, marking them with scars that were often invisible yet deeply felt. The trauma of such experiences is inherited and resonates through generations, shaping the collective consciousness of the Black community. The complicity of white women in the institution of slavery is often rooted in a complex interplay of power dynamics. Many white women were conditioned to believe in their superiority over Black individuals, a belief that masked the vulnerabilities they themselves faced. This internalized racism was exacerbated by societal expectations that positioned them as the caretakers and moral guardians of the home. In their pursuit to maintain the ideals of white womanhood, some resorted to abusing and oppressing Black men, seeing them as threats to their social standing and respectability. This dynamic illustrates the intersection of race and gender, where the struggles of Black men were often minimized in favor of maintaining white women's perceived social superiority. The historical record is filled with accounts that reveal the brutality inflicted on Black male slaves by white women. Yet these narratives remain conspicuously absent from mainstream discussions on slavery. The legacy of this violence is not relegated to the past. It continues to inform contemporary discussions about race, gender, and power in America. The erasure of these experiences from history perpetuates a cycle of misunderstanding and allows the traumatic legacy of slavery to persist unchallenged. It is the responsibility of the current generation to confront this uncomfortable truth. By acknowledging the full complexity of the experiences of Black men during slavery, we honor their realities and begin to unravel the deep roots of oppression that continue to affect our communities today. We must engage with this history critically and thoughtfully, recognizing that the pain of Black men during slavery is woven into the broader fabric of our struggle for justice and equality. This understanding can foster conversations about accountability and healing within our communities. Recognizing the roles that various actors played in the institution of slavery is a step toward dismantling the oppressive structures that still persist today. It allows us to engage in meaningful dialogues about race, gender, and power, paving the way for a more just and equitable society. As we continue to navigate the complexities of our history, let us uplift the voices and experiences of all those who suffered, especially those whose stories have been neglected for too long. The resilience of Black men, despite the abuse they endured at the hands of white women and men alike, is a testament to their strength and humanity. It is our duty to remember, to honor, and to fight for justice in their name. Our liberation, the quest for which has been passed down through generations, remains intertwined with the acknowledgement of all forms of the abuse and oppression that have marked our history. It is time to confront these truths head-on, to challenge the narratives that silence us, and to work towards a future where every story is told and every voice is heard.